Today, let's talk about Japan's Mogami-class multi-mission frigate, and why several countries around the world are looking to acquire them. Since the end of the Second World War, Japan maintained strict export controls on defense equipment. For decades, Tokyo upheld an almost total ban on exporting lethal military systems, which includes most warships. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, or the JMSDF, built warships exclusively for domestic use. No Japanese destroyers, frigates, submarines, or patrol ships were ever exported to another navy between 1945 and the mid-2010s. Since 2014, however, Tokyo has gradually relaxed its rules governing the exports of weapon systems, exempting more types of equipment from the ban. This eventually allowed warships to be sold overseas, but no country actually bought any major surface combatants from Japan until Australia's selection of the Mogami class as its new surface combatants in August 2025. Australia's purchase represents a historic first, the first export of a Japanese-built warship since World War II, and the first major export success for Japan's post-war defense industry. Australia's decision to acquire the Mogami class is not just huge for the Japanese arms industry. It is also one of the most consequential changes in the Royal Australian Navy in a generation. A total of 11 Mogamis are intended to replace Australia's aging fleet of Anzac-class frigates, which are being phased out. For Australia, the choice is justified by three factors: the diversity of the Mogami's armament, the long range and endurance of this blue water warship, and the low number of crew required to run the ship. The upgraded Mogami class outmatched its competitors, particularly Germany's MEKO A200 in all three areas. At 6,200 tons full load and carrying 32 vertical launch cells, the upgraded variant that has been chosen by Australia packs a large amount of firepower for a relatively small warship. It doubles the missile capacity available on the Anzac class and the German MEKO A200 proposal, enabling the Royal Australian Navy to field a far more powerful force with greater diversity in the sort of targets it can engage. We'll get into the armament of the Mogami later, but the key thing is that the upgraded Mogami has received a significant boost in firepower compared to the baseline variants built in Japan. Another advantage that Australia really values is the class's extended operational range and endurance. The upgraded Mogami is one of the longest range frigates in the world, with an exceptional operational range of 10,000 nautical miles, or 18,500 kilometers, in contrast to the Anzac-class frigate's range of about 6,000 nautical miles. The Mogami's extended operational range provides unparalleled coverage capabilities for Australia's Navy, which patrols the country's just under 4 million square miles of exclusive economic zone. The frigate's ability to transport equipment and personnel across vast distances enables it to deliver the essential firepower and other supplies necessary for sustaining long-range presence. This is especially important given Australia is a country the size of a continent, with an extensive coastline that's one of the longest in the world. Equally important is the class's automation that enables a smaller crew size. With a complement of only 90 personnel, half of that of the Anzac class, the upgraded Mogami addresses the Royal Australian Navy's very serious recruitment and retention challenges. Compared to the Mogami, Japan's older Asagiri-class destroyers, which is similar in displacement, require a crew of about 220, while the Anzac-class frigate requires 163, and the German Miko A200 requires 120. To achieve the reduction in personnel size, the Mogami adopts commercial maritime technologies such as the integrated bridge systems, which reduces the required number of bridge crew from around 10 to 4. The Mogami class also includes labor-saving technologies in its damage control and engineering systems, which again minimize manpower requirements. These features are beneficial for Australia, a country that does not maintain nor wish to maintain a large military. The acquisition also reflects Australia's urgent need for speed in terms of construction. The first 3 frigates will be built in Japan, allowing the Royal Australian Navy to field these initial vessels by 2029 or 2030. Following that, 8 more ships will be built at Henderson in Western Australia. This is less about building up a domestic military-industrial base, and more about ensuring that defense spending by Australia actually creates jobs for Australians. And Australia is not the only country taking a serious look at Japan's new frigate. Right across the Tasman, New Zealand has begun its own government-to-government discussions on whether the upgraded Mogami could replace the Royal New Zealand Navy's 2 Anzac frigates. Traditionally, New Zealand has been far more cautious, both in defense spending and in equipment choices, than its Australian neighbour. New Zealand's interest didn't emerge overnight. Over the past 2 years, senior officials from Wellington have visited Japanese naval bases, toured Mogami-class ships in person, and repeatedly raised the design during high-level defense talks. The most public signal came when the Royal New Zealand Navy chief openly expressed interest in the upgraded Mogami during a meeting with Japan's defense minister. That was followed by the New Zealand Prime Minister's visit to the Japanese naval base at Yokosuka, where he toured the Mogami frigate, the JS Kumano, himself. I won't speculate on why New Zealand is signaling interest in the Mogami. The only thing I'll say is this. First, the timing aligns almost perfectly with New Zealand's 2025 Defence Capability Plan, its blueprint, in its own words, to rebuild the Defence Force. As part of that, most of the New Zealand surface fleet, the Anzac frigate, will reach end of life by the mid-2030s, and replacement decisions must soon be made. Second, New Zealand faces the same challenge Australia does, recruiting and retaining sailors. A modern frigate with a dramatically smaller crew requirement is inherently more attractive. So, while nothing has been formally decided, New Zealand's level of engagements suggests that the Mogami is becoming one of the key candidates for the Royal New Zealand Navy's future surface combatant program. But perhaps the most interesting potential customer for the Mogami class isn't Australia or New Zealand at all. It's actually Indonesia. And Indonesia's reasons for looking at the upgraded Mogami are very different from those of its neighbours. Where Australia and New Zealand are replacing the existing Anzac class and looking for surface combatants with slim crewing requirements, Indonesia is pursuing something far broader, a long-term naval modernization strategy and the expansion of its domestic naval shipbuilding industry. For Jakarta, the Mogami deal, the potential deal, would not be just about the frigate. It would be an industrial partnership. This is why discussions between Tokyo and Jakarta have focused not only on buying ships, but potentially co-developing and co-producing them. Under Japan's proposal, 4 frigates would be built in Japanese shipyards, while another 4 could be produced locally by Indonesia. Indonesia has been engaging with a wide range of actors to develop its civil and naval shipbuilding industry, ranging from the UK to China and Japan and even Russia. In fact, alongside the Mogami, Indonesia is weighing the alternative option of purchasing older Chinese frigates from China, the Type 053H3. Well, the Type 053H3, being a much older frigate and therefore less capable, is unlikely to be chosen over the Mogami. This does illustrate that Indonesia is pursuing beneficial partnerships with the major powers on all sides of the geopolitical divide. As a side note, Jakarta has announced that it plans to buy at least 42 Chinese-made J-10C fighter jets. This shows that Indonesia wants to diversify its defense suppliers, reduce dependence on any single bloc, and build up its own industrial capacity. This fits neatly with Jakarta's broader multi-alignment foreign policy, where it balances relationships with Western countries, regional partners, and major powers like China and Russia. Also, unlike Australia and New Zealand, Indonesia is not seeking a like-for-like replacement of a specific class of warship. The Mogami, if acquired, represents a straight-up addition to the scale of the Indonesian Navy. Indonesia is also not operating within an alliance framework, where interoperability with Japanese or American systems is the priority. This allows Indonesia to really just build and buy whatever it needs according to its own requirements. In short, Indonesia's interest in the Mogami class stems less from alliance considerations and far more from strategic autonomy and industrial development, making it a fundamentally different case from Australia and New Zealand. To understand why so many countries are now taking a serious look at the Mogami class, we need to go back to the beginning, back to why Japan built this ship in the first place. The Mogami program began as a response to a structural manpower problem inside the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. Put simply, Japan needed more ships, and it needed them quickly, but it could no longer afford to operate large crews. Its older destroyers and destroyer escorts, especially the Asagiri and Abu Kuma classes, were reaching the end of their service lives. These ships were products of a different era, built when manpower was easier to recruit and when Japan faced a much simpler threat environment. By 2015, things had changed. Japan needed a compact, affordable frigate that could be mass-produced and that could perform the everyday, unglamorous task required to keep the fleet functioning: patrol work, anti-submarine escorts duties, and mine countermeasures. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries initially proposed a futuristic, high-speed design called the 30FF, but the JMSDF eventually opted for a more conservative and more practical variant, the 30DX. This became the Mogami class. The goal was clear: build a modern frigate, but with half the number of crew. Anti-submarine warfare naturally shaped the ship's operational focus. The JMSDF is, above all else, an anti-submarine navy. Japan's geography demands it. The country sits beside deep waters at the edge of the Pacific, with Russian and Chinese submarines regularly operating in areas that intersect with Japan's sea lanes and maritime approaches. Every tanker, every cargo ship, every American reinforcement entering the Western Pacific passes through waters where submarines could operate. In fact, during the Cold War, the US military strategy for the Pacific demands that Japan's naval forces provide the localized anti-submarine warfare capacity, which can hold off Soviet submarines and prevents them from dominating the Western Pacific, before US Navy reinforcements could arrive. For the JMSDF, anti-submarine warfare is not a specialized skill. It is the traditional backbone of national defense. And this is exactly where the Mogami class has been optimized. The ship carries Japan's most modern sonar suite, a towed array, a variable depth sonar, and a hull-mounted mine-hunting sonar. Together, these systems allow the Mogami to detect submarines in a range of acoustic conditions, from deep ocean to shallow coastal waters. When a hostile submarine is found, the Mogami can destroy it using the Type 12 lightweight torpedoes, or, more importantly, the Type 07 vertical launch ASROC, which delivers an anti-submarine torpedo at long range. Equally significant is the vessel's aviation capability. The Mogami carries the SH-60L Seahawk, Japan's license-built variant of the US Navy's workhorse anti-submarine helicopter. This dramatically increases the ship's sensor coverage and lethality. Because a helicopter can deploy sonobuoys far from the ship and attack submarines without putting the frigate itself in danger. Taken together, the sensors, weapons, and aviation assets make the Mogami class a highly capable anti-submarine escort, arguably one of the best. However, when it comes to air defense, the Mogami is more limited. This is not because the ship is poorly designed, but because it was optimized for different missions. The original Mogami class carries a 16-cell Mark 41 vertical launch system, expected to equip medium-range air defense missiles. That is enough to field a credible self-defense missile loadout. But 16 cells do not give the ship the volume of fire required for high-intensity fleet air defense. The JMSDF never intended the Mogami to stand against saturation missile attacks. That role belongs to the larger Aegis-equipped destroyers. Japan did try to soften that disadvantage, and that is why the upgraded Mogami, also known as the new FFM, was designed with 32 VLS cells. This is the ship purchased by Australia. This doubles the available missile capacity and significantly expands the potential missile mix. It does not turn the ship into a full air defense destroyer, but it gives allied navies like Australia the flexibility to load evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, the SM-2 or even the SM-6, depending on their operational needs. For Japan itself, the expanded VLS count ensures the future frigate fleet, both in Japan and Australia, has better survivability and more staying power. On the offensive side, the Mogami carries the Type 17 anti-ship missile, which is the latest evolution of Japan's surface-launched strike weapons. Although the Mogami was never intended to be a dedicated surface strike platform, 8 anti-ship missiles give the ship a credible ability to engage enemy vessels around the Japanese archipelago. The Type 12 torpedo also plays a dual role, because modern lightweight torpedoes can threaten both submarines and smaller surface combatants in coastal waters. And on top of that, The Mogami includes equipment for deploying naval mines, a capability that aligns closely with its coastal defense and sea lane protection missions. But perhaps the most distinctive feature of the Mogami class, the one that will shape future naval design thinking, is stealth. Unlike previous JMSDF escorts, the Mogami is built from the ground up around signature reduction. The hull features sloped surfaces and clean lines that deflect radar energy. The ship's superstructure is compact, uncluttered, and intentionally designed to minimize external sensors and protrusions that would raise radar signature. The centerpiece of this effort is the integrated mast. Rather than mounting radar arrays, antennas, and communication systems on exposed platforms, the Mogami houses them within a single enclosed structure topped by a composite radome. This not only reduces radar cross-section, but also improves electromagnetic compatibility by separating sensitive systems physically while still embedding them within the same structural housing. The radome itself contains the ship's passive radar sensors, communication gear, electronic support measures, and IFF, or identification, friend or foe. Japanese engineers emphasize that these components can be swapped out quickly, an important factor when operating a fleet of 22 ships where sustainment and turnaround time matter. A stealthy frigate that is hard to find on radar is essentially far more survivable, especially given that defensive armaments and sensors on frigates will always be more limited compared to destroyers. So, when you combine all these elements, the low personnel requirement, the anti-submarine warfare capability, the helicopter, the modest but meaningful air defense potential, and the stealth shaping, you get a very specific type of warship. Not a frontline cruiser, not a destroyer, but a lower-cost platform that can be built in large numbers. It is great at one mission to fight submarines, but can also do many others to a lesser degree, and that flexibility is really valued by smaller navies who really need to make every ship count. And that is exactly why countries around the Pacific region are paying attention to the Mogami-class frigate.